Hey guys, this is Ben. Welcome to my YouTube channel, Ben Cruising Alaska, and today we're going to discuss the Asfir skid plates that I have underneath my 100 series Land Cruiser. Dong. So first things first here, these two are not my dogs. They are our friend Buck and Haley's dogs. This is Oakley and this is Delta. They're both really great dogs, but the neighbor kids are being a little bit rambunctious per usual, so they're kind of growling here and there. So please excuse the growls and maybe occasional bark if you hear any. So just right off the bat here, this is not a sponsored review. I paid for these skid plates with my own money. If you're short on time and you're just looking for me to cut to the chase and give my opinion, I'll do that right now. I think these skid plates are a good skid plate system for general off-roading, but I would not recommend them for heavier rock-related off-roading. I would definitely probably get a different set of skids if I was doing some really heavy rock stuff, just because the medium-ish rock work that I've done with these skid plates myself have caused a little bit of problems here. So I can't recommend them for too much around the rocks, but I think if you're just looking for general use skid plates and you're not getting into the rocks too much, you know, just the occasional every now and then, I think these skid plates are a really good solution. And I'll kind of go into my thoughts behind all of that in this video. The Asfir skid plates here are aluminum and they're 1/4 inch thick. The four pieces are the front skid plate, the transmission skid plate, the transfer case skid plate, and the fuel tank skid plate. And for the purpose of this video, I'm only going to be talking about aluminum skid plates here. I feel like a lot of people kind of choose their material for skid plates first based on the weight, and then they look at the offerings within those. So if you want steel, that's definitely a decision that you can make yourself. But I like aluminum, I like that it's lightweight, and I don't think I need steel skid plates for what I do up here in Alaska with my 100 series. But if you do want steel skid plates, then that's definitely something to consider here. But like I said, aluminum skid plates here, and I'm just going to keep the topic of this video to be at aluminum skid plates, just to keep it all pretty simple. So we'll start with the pros of these skid plates and then we'll go through the cons. The Asfir skid plate system here does offer pretty much full protection of your underbody, and that's definitely important to have when you're off-roading. The last thing you want to do is, you know, go over a branch or a rock or something like that and it damages something on your underbody. So, you know, these skid plates provide a good coverage, a large area of coverage underneath your 100 series Land Cruiser, in addition to the fuel tank skid, which isn't really an offering for other skid plate systems. So as far as the overall coverage goes of these skid plates, I would say that's definitely pretty good. The installation of these skid plates is pretty straightforward. Kind of depends on how rusty the underneath of your Land Cruiser is. My Land Cruiser is pretty rusty, so you know, it can kind of be annoying to deal with the rust underneath there, but getting these skid plates on wasn't too bad. There are a couple of like these inserts with threads on them that you've got to kind of, you know, put through places so that the bolt can have something to catch onto on the other side. So that can take a little bit of time when you're putting these skid plates together, but overall it's not really too bad as far as the installation goes. I do have a 1-inch diff drop. So what I did there with the installation was I just used the spacers up front towards the front end of the Land Cruiser here, and I did not use the spacers on the actual cross member itself down there where the diff drop is, and that seems to have worked out fine. It did kind of bend the skid plate a little bit when I was bolting it up, but it's held up fine as far as that goes. So if you do have a diff drop, you can use these skid plates, and you might just kind of have to play around with where you put the spacers, but having spacers up front for me with no spacers on the cross member seemed to work out fine as far as the diff drop goes. They're pretty affordable compared to a lot of skid plate options. So in Alaska here, shipped to my door, they were $1,300 in 2022, and I believe I had some kind of sale or something going on that I applied with that. So your mileage may vary depending on what kind of sales and everything are going at the time, and then obviously compared with the competition, which I'll talk about a little bit later. But that's what I paid for them in 2022, and that was the full 4-piece skid plate system. In Alaska, we have a ton of mud on our trails here, and I've seen some skid plate systems where they have like wings on the side, and it just makes it really difficult to clean mud. I kind of appreciate how these skid plates just have a flat profile on them. So for the skids that are on the underbelly part, that makes it pretty easy to clean mud out of them. Another pro for these skids is that it includes a fuel tank skid if you get the full 4-piece set. And to my knowledge, I don't think any of the other manufacturers like Descent or Talon or Slee, even the ones that make steel skid plates, I don't think that any of them have that fuel tank skid as well. So That's definitely a good skid to have. I need to keep it a little bit more clean because it kind of presses up against the fuel tank, and you definitely don't want any mud holding up against there. That's pretty much the only skid plate in this set that's kind of difficult to clean mud out of, so I make sure to try to get a pressure washer in the corners of it, just to make sure the mud stays out of that one. If mud builds up between the Asfir skid plate and the factory skid plate, then basically it'll hold moisture and, you know, make it more likely to rust down there. So I did have to buy a new factory skid plate because this skid plate here mounts to the factory skid plate, and my old factory skid plate was pretty rusted from the previous owner or previous owners. And so I did have to buy a new factory skid plate. So if your factory skid plate's in rough shape, you might have to buy a new one when you get this set, but that's not a big deal. It's probably a good thing to have anyways. Another pro to these skid plates is that your motor oil change is pretty easy. I do recommend that you get one of those oil filter funnels, and I can link the one below that I have on Amazon that somebody shared with on Instagram that works perfectly for these skid plates. But yeah, changing the oil on these, I just did the other week, super easy. Your front diff fluid change too is going to be pretty easy with these. As far as a lot of the other maintenance goes, you might have to remove these skid plates to do that. If you're going to grease your drive shafts, you'll definitely have to remove these skid plates, which is why I'm doing this review today actually, because I need to grease my drive shafts, so I figured why not go under there and review these skid plates here. Another pro for these skid plates is they don't bend in too easily for the actual skid plates themselves. I banged up the skid plates pretty good, and they've held up pretty well, just with the exception of the cross members, and I'll kind of get to that in the cons. But when we're talking about just the plate part of the skids here, they've held up pretty good as far as impacts and everything else goes over the 3 years that I've used them up here in Alaska. The last pro that I thought of with these skid plates is that you can change the CV axle with the skid plate still on. It's kind of a pain, so if you can, I would take the skid plate off, but if you're in a pinch on the trail or something like that and you're unable to take your skid plate off, you can pull out the CV axle with the skid plate still on. It requires a little bit more kind of wedging back and forth, but I have done it in the garage before just because I was lazy and didn't feel like taking off the skid plate, and I wanted to see if I could take out the CV axle with the skid plate still on. So you can do that, and it's actually not that bad. Owning these skid plates for about 3 years now, I've definitely noticed some downsides to them as well, and we'll kind of walk through the downsides of them here. The off-roading that we do up here in Alaska is pretty typical. I would say we pretty much have everything as far as obstacles go, except for really large rocks. So if you're into Moab, you know, and going to places like that, then that's definitely something I don't have too much experience with. But with pretty much everything else, water crossings, deep ruts, hill climbs, you name it, we've pretty much got most of all that here in Alaska. And I have a pretty good, few years under my belt of experience in going through all that with these skid plates on my Land Cruiser. So for the cons here of these skid plates, I would say the first thing is definitely the washer design. So like I said, I don't really do too much huge rock stuff up here in Alaska. We don't really have too much huge rock stuff up here in Alaska, but I've definitely done, some kind of medium-ish sized rocks, and as well as just, hitting the skid plates on all sorts of other stuff on the trail, logs, whatever else. And basically what happens a lot is the washer gets bent in, and then it kind of wedges itself up against the bolt. You've got to kind of wedge something between the washer and the bolt to try to get the washer out so that you can get a socket around the bolt to take the skid plates off. And the washers are pretty annoying to replace because you have to order a set of them from Asfir, and then depending on where you're at, I don't know if all international shipping is the same, but they quoted me like $40 shipping just for a package of washers. So I was able to find some side-by-side washers that are very similar in design. They're not quite as deep, but I'll make them work for now. I got them on Amazon for pretty cheap, so I can't really complain about that too much. I have seen washers with like ramps on them. The problem with these washers is that the way that they nestle the bolt into the frame, you kind of need these style of washers basically for this skid plate with that kind of recess in the washer itself. And the washer has to be the same size as the actual hole that it goes into, because it's what keeps it pressed up against the frame as well. So I would definitely say the washer design isn't the best in the world. I've had to replace a few of them myself, and I'm gonna have to go back under today when I remove these skid plates and go through and replace a few more. Another con with these skid plates is if you have sliders, you might have to get a little creative with how one of the cross members fits around the sliders. I'll kind of show it here. But basically one of the skid plate cross members kind of collides with your slider. And so I was able to put like a little nut in there as a spacer and just kind of use that to make sure that the cross member still had something to press up against with the U-bolts on my white knuckle sliders being in the way of that typically. So kind of depends on what slider setup you have as well. So I'll just kind of throw that out there, you know, do with that what you will. Maybe some of you guys don't have sliders. In that case, not a big deal, not a con at all. So just something to think about there. So on the topic of cross members here, the one that goes over the exhaust by the T-case skid plate is kind of annoying to deal with, because what happens a lot of the time is it bends in pretty easily because it's just connected on one side of the frame, the other side of the frame. So that cross member itself will bend in, and then it, you know, kind of presses against your exhaust and will cause this rattling noise. So it took me a little bit to figure out what that noise was when I first had it, and then I figured out, oh hey, the skid plate cross member is actually pressing up against the exhaust, because it wouldn't happen all the time, but just at certain speeds and everything. And that's just because, you know, everything's vibrating kind of at a little bit different frequency there, so it's more noticeable sometimes than it is other times. Definitely keep a lookout for that though. If you do have these skid plates, or if you buy them, that skid plate might bend in and kind of, you know, make some noise against your exhaust there. It's not a huge deal, but it is a little bit annoying. So it'd be kind of nice if there's like maybe a support in the middle or something, so that it didn't get, you know, pressed into the exhaust all the time and it gets bent there. Or maybe some kind of a other system there where there's, you know, some more support maybe around the exhaust itself or something, just to stop it from getting pressed into the exhaust. So for the last con, this is kind of similar to the slider thing, where it depends on what setup you have. But I have an ARB front bumper here. This is a super popular front bumper, and I did have to trim the wings of the front skid plate a little bit. Not a lot, I just went in there and cut a little bit off. So you don't have to go crazy with it on the front skid plate, but depending on your bumper setup, you might have to trim a little bit of the wings there. So that's something else just to consider if you get these skid plates here, is what kind of front bumper you have. And you know, you might have to do a little bit of cutting to get that front skid plate there to work with your front bumper, but not a huge deal, just something to think about. There's two competitors with Asfir for full aluminum skid plate systems that I know of. The first one's a little bit newer of an offering. It's the Talon Garage aluminum skid plate system. That one wouldn't work for me just because it has a raised edge kind of lip thing on both sides of the belly skids. And for me, that would just create like a little mud puddle, and I would have nowhere to blast the mud out of when I'm washing it back at home. And there'd be nowhere, you know, in water crossings or anything. Sometimes all the mud just gets washed out in a water crossing. But kind of with that raised edge there, it would definitely introduce some problems with holding onto mud and rocks and branches and everything else that gets caught up underneath the Land Cruiser here in Alaska. The other option that exists for full aluminum skid plates here for the 100 series Land Cruiser are the Descent Off-Road skid plates. I have the Descent Off-Road steel rear bumper. There's no question about it that the Descent Off-Road build quality is just spectacular. It's always been very good. They're out in California, and they have some really, really quality stuff coming out of there. So the Descent Off-Road skids, they look great. They do also have a similar kind of sidewall that might block some mud from getting out. But looking at some pictures online, it looks like they might not be quite as bad as the Talon's Garage ones. It looks like there's a little bit more room for stuff to kind of get blasted out there, and then there's like some channels and everything. If you just kind of look at the design, they have a nice layout of it on their website. And I would definitely not question that the Descent Off-Road skid plates are going to be a lot more stout than the Asfir ones that I have now, and probably the Talon's ones as well. They probably hold very well, and I would venture to guess that you're not really going to be bending them in at all. Just because of the construction that they have, the reinforcements that they have. If you look at kind of the engineering behind them on the designs on their website, you can definitely see where the reinforcements are, and overall they look a little bit more engineered than the Asfir ones that I have right now. The Asfir ones have definitely required a little bit of upkeep here, so if I could do it all over again, I might buy the Descent Off-Road skid plates if I saved up a little bit more money, but it was a good few $100s more to buy the Descent Off-Road skid plates. I think it was probably a little bit over $2,000 at the time that I was looking to buy for the Descent Off-Road skid plates, where the Asfir skid plates were about $1,300 shipped to my door. So even if I do upgrade to the Descent Off-Road skids, I'll still keep the Asfir gas tank skid that I have on there, just because that's a really useful thing to have. So, you know, hopefully that kind of helps influence your decision on what aluminum skid plates you'd want for your 100 series. Like I said at the beginning, I would definitely recommend the Asfir skid plates for just general off-road use. But if you are going to be getting a little bit more into the heavy kind of rock world of things, as far as that goes, maybe I would look at something else. Maybe I'd look at the Descent Off-Road skid plates or consider steel. But the Descent Off-Road do look very strong. Even though they're aluminum, The construction of them is very good, and the engineering behind them is pretty good as well. I think a lot of what I said here is generally agreed upon in the 100 series community, between the I Hate Mud forums and the UZJ100 Facebook group. It seems like a lot of people kind of have similar thoughts. So that's all I've got here for you guys today. If you're looking for a set of skids for your 100 series Land Cruiser, I hope the review of my Asfir skid plates here have kind of helped you in that decision-making process, and we'll catch you guys around. If you enjoyed this video, please make sure to give a like, share, subscribe. All that helps here grow the channel as we kind of move forward with making more videos. So we've got some really fun trip videos coming up for you guys. I'm really excited to get to editing those. I did just recently buy a MacBook computer because my PC is ancient, and I have been editing videos on a 1060 graphics card, if that gives any reference of how old of a computer I've been working with here. So we've got some really fun stuff coming up, and I think the edits here of my videos should hopefully get a lot better, and they'll just be a lot smoother for me to be able to go through and actually edit, 4K videos and everything else. So we'll catch you guys around. Like I said, like, share, subscribe, all that good stuff. Thanks for watching.